I've watched it about 5 times now. It's brilliant. It's 5 minutes of just like these starlings, just like
sounds like a good antidote for the internet.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can get started here. And this is just kind of, while I've got some things to present going through this week, it's also a bit of discussion time. So if you want to say something, just pop in. Okay. Okay, so as we go through this, I want to talk a little bit about some of the esoteric meanings, some of the Gnostic meanings, some of the mystical meanings, a little bit about energy and some of the special Gnostic takes on it, or Gnostic-like takes on it. So for Palm Sunday, I talked a little bit about how that represents the high point of kind of the earthly experience, and then we have the crescendo down. So the big days, of course, are Thursday, which is the day of the Last Supper, Good Friday, which is the day of the crucifixion, and then Sunday morning, which is the resurrection. And I think as we had talked about in one of the other meetings, or maybe Steve and I had talked about it, people celebrate kind of Easter 2 ways. Some people celebrate it with a Saturday night vigil. And I think you were mentioning, Steve, that you had, been with groups that actually did the sort of 24-hour vigil through the night, which something in the future. And then there's other groups, like, I come from a tradition, growing up, I came from a tradition of Easter sunrise service, which was always like a 6 a.m. thing. So that we're doing 6:30 is a little bit different, and for me, that was always kind of a very special time. So I've picked that. But when I was with the Gnostic Church in Chicago, we would always do the Saturday evening vigil. And I think it's pretty much the same, it's a similar sort of, well, there's a bit difference, I think, in the idea. I think when you're doing the Saturday evening vigil, it's a waiting for that sunrise day and that sort of the recognition of the risen Christ. Meanwhile, with the Easter sunrise thing, it's kind of like that day starts with the discovering of the empty tomb. So it all gets to the same place in the end.
Pam, you also have in some traditions, I don't know if they emphasize this in the Gnostic Church, but in some traditions, the period between Jesus's death and his resurrection, he descends into hell to kind of free captives from that realm. So there's almost like there's like a rescue mission going on at the same time.
Yeah, and that's actually, I was just kind of scroll to that point, because that kind of brings up a little bit about what I'm kind of planning our Friday evening to our Friday afternoon program to look like. And because there's this wonderful, there was this in G.R.S. Meads, in his Quest Near New and Old, talks about this Gnostic group in Syrian, a rather late Gnostic group, maybe 7th century, 7th or even 8th century Gnostic group, that had a special crucifixion ritual. And there's enough of that from what's been written, and they were using a book called the Book of Hierotheus, which is there's only like a few excerpts of it that have been available and published. So if anyone, has any desire to learn Coptic, apparently the whole thing is supposedly sitting in the British Museum somewhere, waiting to be translated by somebody, along with the books of Jude and these other ones that were from the same codex as the Pistis Sophia. But so anyway, this Stephen ben Sahare was this Syrian Gnostic during this time, and they had this sort of process of really going down there into hell and redeeming oneself, and it's actually described from a personal standpoint. So I'd like to kind of do that, and it's really kind of based on this idea from like the Gospel of Philip. The idea that God is a dyer. And if you've ever done any sort of dyeing of cloth or fabric, you've put everything into the dye pit, and then you pull it up, you let it dry, and then if it's not quite right again, you throw it into the dye again. And that's this point here from the Gospel of Philip, that God is a dyer, and just as good dyes and genuine dyes dissolve what is dyed into them, there's also the one who God dyes becomes immortal through all his colors, and the colors become immortal. So that it's really gets to kind of this idea of karma as well. That until we quite get it right, or until we quite get ourselves purified, or until we quite get rid of whatever sort of nagging thing there is back, in the back of our mind, we're kind of forced into kind of repeating it again. If we think of something like that of, guilt is probably a good one, that until you can get to a point where you're actually resolved of something you feel guilty about, one way or another, it's going to keep kind of coming up and nagging at you. So on Friday, I want to do this kind of exercise from Hierotheus, of this sort of going down and descending, meeting this again, and then kind of bringing this up to light. So it's that same as you're talking about, Steve, that same sort of process of this idea of the descent into hell, then the ascent into heaven. That happens on Good Friday.
Yeah, I suppose if you were thinking about it in like Jungian psychological terms, we could think about the integration of the unconscious as well. So in some ways we're connecting with the shadow and the unconscious in order to bring it, Jung talks about bringing the shadow into the light so that you can kind of integrate that material. It's kind of like an alchemical process, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly that. What they write about it in the book of Hierotheus kind of goes through this, but it's very Jungian, and it's kind of like what can be done in some like the regression therapy as well, where you kind of go and face something, and there's a bit of desensitization about that initial facing, and then a period of recognition and redemption, almost. Now, the Gospel of Philip doesn't really go into detail about this, and the Gospel of Philip doesn't really talk about Holy Week at all, but it uses this metaphor a lot, which, you know, makes me wonder if there's something else out there. And this book of Hierotheus is actually cited a lot in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. He makes reference to it, and the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius are very much a Platonic work, but still one can see a lot of the of Gnostic elements in it. So it's rather, while it's mystical, kind of a mystical Christian, it's also esoteric, and it's elements of kind of this Gnostic Platonism. So, but the Pseudo-Dionysius and his works on like the celestial hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, mystical names, they're good things to read if you ever get bored. Run out of things to look at. So I thought that was something that we could do as a take for Good Friday. Yeah, and I actually always loved Good Friday growing up, because, and when I was with the conventional Lutheran churches and that, because it was this time that was just where the only time in the Lutheran calendar system where people are actually encouraged for some sort of emotional catharsis. And we would have sometimes some very good, you know, baritones or singers singing these old, you know, kind of mournful gospel songs about the death as you go through it and the crucifixion. And, you know, Lutherans are usually taught to be control of their emotions. So this time of outbreak it was something else. A lot of what in the modern Gnostic churches, what we use, and a lot of the teachings around kind of the Gnostic takes on the Gospels are often about the Acts of John. And we'll be doing a bit of, when we get to Monday, Thursday, that service is really associated, taking a lot from the Acts of John. And that, in the Acts of John, is a really interesting book. It's what's considered to be a non-canonical book. So it's been around in, like, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Church since its first writing, somewhere around like, I think it's thought to be around, you know, 4th or 5th century. But it really, it's kind of stayed out of the way of Western Christianity. And if you can find copies of the Acts of John online, and there's like 3 different parts of it. The first part reads like a lot of the other canonical books, where they just are talking about the various different miracles and initial preachings of John. And this is John, the beloved disciple, and John of the Gospel, not Revelations. So the first part is kind of just so. The second part tells the story of two of John's leading disciples, who's this married couple called Drusiana and Androcles, as her husband. And I think it's real interesting because it's like one of the only real visions we get to part of how did Jesus's hierarchy work? Because if we read in the gospel, we all know that Jesus had like the 12 disciples underneath them. If we read in Luke, he's got the 12 and he sends out the 12 to do some sort of preaching and spread the gospel, and they come back together. And then from there, he sends out 72 pairs that also go again and preach and come back. Well, 72 pairs would be 144 people, which is, of course, 12 times 12. And this is kind of borne out in the Acts of the Apostles, where we can tell that under every apostle had like 12 people underneath them. And then those disciples so you got the first 12 disciples, each of them have 12 people underneath them. Then each of them had 12 people underneath them. And we see there the sort of structure and almost a pyramid scheme that was happening during Jesus's ministry. And that's where in the Acts of the Apostles, one of the first things that's covered there is that they need to find somebody to take Judas Iscariot's place, because he's got he's got this structure underneath him of his 12 people and the other and those below them. So they vote and they identify somebody to take, I think it's Matthias, to take over that. So we've got this. So you've got this 12 and then 12 below them and 12 below them. And that's where and it's kind of, that structure makes sense of why we end up with gospels associated with actually one of these disciples. So we've got the Gospel of Philip, we've got the Gospel of Matthew, of John, even the Gospel of Judas. So anyway, under John's structure, two of his leading disciples are this married couple of Drusiana and Androcles. And the second part of the second part of the Acts of John tells the story about part of their two ministries. And I think it's real important because we don't really have that many examples of married couples, actually going out and promoting the work. But if you think about it, if you're going to send somebody out to, spread the news, if you have a couple, a man and a woman together, first of all, in that, sexually segregated society back in the Middle East, you needed almost a woman to preach to women and a man to preach to men, because you didn't really have this sort of mixture happening, because men couldn't go into places that were identified for women and vice versa. And also, a couple is generally less threatening going out, than hordes of, single men. They're not going to raise a suspicion if you're going to start the ministry. So the more I've thought about it, I've thought that when he sends out the 72 pairs, most likely we're talking about male and female pairs. We're talking about couples. So anyway, the second part of the Acts of it it's a rather interesting story of Drusiana and Androcles, and the story that happens, this sort of passion story that happens around Drusiana. And in the course of this, as they're going about their ministry, they have one of their followers. When John is away, one of their followers becomes enamored with Drusiana, and he's trying to, he's he's trying to get it on with Drusiana. And Drusiana, in her virtue, you know, she tries to get him to go away. He's not having it. So she decides, in order to preserve her virtue and that of Androcles, she just kind of wills herself dead, which should solve the problem, you'd think. But this guy who's lusting after her, he has decided that, well, if he can't have her alive, at least he can have her dead. He bribes the guy. There's a man guarding her tomb while everybody else is mourning in the funeral service. He bribes the guard to let him in there and have his way to Drusiana. Well, once he gets in there, what happens is that this, you know, as he gets close to her, he sees this vision that blinds him, and the snake appears. Poisonous snake appears, bites him, and he dies. And then the guard who he bribed comes in there to see what's happened, and he's also bit by this deadly snake. So at this point, John shows up, and you know, they're trying to figure out, why are these two dead guys here in the tomb with Drusiana? And John says, well, you know, I've got an idea to figure this out. So he goes and he resurrects this Callimachus, who is the guy who had been lusting after Drusiana. Well, so John resurrects that guy from the dead, and he confesses everything. He says he's sorry, you know, he was going to make bad with Drusiana's body, you know, but you know, now he's kind of seen the light. Then he's come back, he recognized how wrong that is. So they're in the tomb, you know, and this guy is told what he confesses to, what he was going to violate Drusiana's body. And Androcles points out, well, John, you know, you've just resurrected this guy. Can't you do something about Drusiana? And so John then resurrects Drusiana. And they're all kind of confessing. They bring Drusiana up to speed on what's happened. And she says, well, you know, if Callimachus, who was the cause of all this, you know, what about this other guy who's laying here? And John tells her, well, you know, you've got the power, you've got your belief in Christ, you resurrect him if you want. So Drusiana then resurrects him. And I think this is the only story I've come across where it actually talks about one of the women followers doing a resurrection, you know, resurrecting someone from the dead. And it's just kind of a very cool story. And apparently during the Middle Ages, there would be passion plays about this. As you can imagine, it's because it's got everything everybody wants to know, a little bit of romance, a little bit of horror and smut, you know, it's a sort of thing that would work well in a passion play. But, you know, so the second part of the Acts of John is an interesting point. But getting to the third part of the Acts of John is where it really gets at the head of a lot of the Gnostic ideas about Jesus. And it's some of the Gnostic docetic ideas about Jesus being more of a spiritual being instead of more of a physical being. So the third part starts out where John starts talking about how they were, as disciples, they weren't quite sure how material Jesus was. So they would do things like kind of subtly try to walk behind him and see if he was actually leaving footprints in the sand. Or they would really watch him to make sure he was really eating everything and not just pretending like he was eating. to really see if he was really the sort of physical person. And they, kind of try to check on him to see if he was really asleep and doing just kind of normal human things. So at one point, Jesus catches John doing this, trying to see if he's really physical or not. And Jesus says, what are you doing? He says, well, we're not quite sure, you're a son of God, if you're spiritual or really physical. And Jesus says to him, he says, well, if I wasn't a physical person, could I do this? And he takes a good yank of John's beard. And John writes that he was sore for several days after Jesus had shown him this. So then one of the things that's recorded in so John goes on and talks a little bit, but when he gets to the whole point of HolyWeek, he talks about the Last Supper. And while he describes kind of the overview of the Last Supper, I included the washing of the feet in that. What he also describes is this sort of what's called the Hymn of Jesus, which is this dance that was done. And J.R.S. Mead talks about that he thinks the Hymn of Jesus was really not just a plain celebratory dance, but was actually an initiation. That he says he thinks it was an initiation because what you've got all the disciples in a circle, and J.R.S. Mead thought that Jesus would be in the circle with an initiate. And they go through this whole process of the dance. And so this is something that we're going to do. I want to do this part for Monday, Thursday. So somebody can, it would be good if somebody could volunteer to be an initiate for this. If not, I'll nominate somebody, but so think about that and let me know. And if we had more people, we could do breakout rooms and do this in groups of 3s. But since we're not going to have that. So the Hymn of Jesus is kind of this sort of initiatory dance that's done according to J.R.S. Mead. Then the later later on in the Acts of John, they talk about the docetic idea of the cross of glory, which is this idea that Jesus, and we'll go through, that will be kind of the theme of the story for Easter morning. Because it really, what it is in the story of the cross of glory, briefly, is that John is looking down at the crucifixion. He's seeing the cross up there, down below. He's in a cave looking down at the 3 crosses, and he's starting to mourn. And at that point, as he's starting to mourn, he hears this voice behind him, basically saying, "What's the matter with you, John?" And John looks behind him, and he sees Jesus. He looks down, and there's 3 crosses there's 3 bodies on the cross below. He looks back, and there's Jesus again. And then Jesus explains the whole, explains and gives an explanation of more of the spiritual essence of what's going on, which is really the Gnostic take and the docetic take on what happened over through the crucifixion. And we'll do that on Easter. I don't want to be a spoiler and describe all of that now. So so that's kind of what happens with the Acts of John. When we look at the Gnostic the Gnostic scriptures, we don't see a lot about how Gnostics celebrated, or if they celebrated, the whole Easter thing. One of them, the only one that really wrote a lot about the crucifixion, and that was Valentinus. And Valentinus actually had a take rather similar to the esoteric groups, the esoteric Jonanite way. And if you've ever read like the Gospels, 3 first Gospels, and then you read the Gospel of John, there's a number of stories in the Gospel of John that aren't recorded in the other 3. And there's also detail and emphasis on some of the more mystical aspects. And this is where, prior to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi in the French Gnostic tradition, people just used the Gospel of John. And part of it is that in the Gospel of John, the first words of institution, where Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," and then at another point, he says, "Take bread. This is my body. Have some of this wine. This is my blood. Eat of me. I am the vine and I am the life." And this is done actually prior to the Last Supper in the Gospel of John. And there's also a discourse in the at the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, where he goes through the detail about explaining this metaphor more about being the vine and being the fruit. And Valentinus writes about this in the Gospel of Truth. He writes about how the crucifixion is seen as Jesus is on the tree, like he is the fruit and the salvation being on the tree. And this whole metaphor of the fruit and the vine is called out in the Gospel of John. Another interesting thing, if you look at the Gospel of John, it actually starts detailing events the week before the Passover, the Last Supper. And prior to the week before, Jesus was called to go visit Mary and Martha and Lazarus, because Lazarus was terribly sick. And when Jesus gets there, Lazarus has already died. And Jesus says, and they're like, it's too bad you couldn't be here earlier. You could have saved him. And Jesus like, no, he's still good. I'll go into the tomb and find him. And if Mary and Martha's like, "Oh no, I wouldn't do that if I was you. He's been in there a couple days. It's going to be ripe." Jesus, no. So Jesus goes in, and of course he resurrects Lazarus. Then it's like and then he goes into hiding because people have found out that he's raised Lazarus from the dead. And it's so everybody who's got any problems wants to be out there then, because obviously Jesus has got a lot of power and people are flocking to him. Now there's a book written a few years ago by Martin Smith called On the Secret Book of Mark. And, this isn't just something new. If we go, St. Clement of Alexandria talks about this secret book of Mark. And the secret book of Mark makes a call that this Lazarus was an example of an initiation that was done. That it wasn't that Lazarus had actually physically died, that Lazarus had gone through this initiatory period of being essentially dead to the world for 3 days and then being brought back. Hold on, let me just not answer that. Of being brought back again. Sorry about that. And, but so that Lazarus was really part of an initiation ceremony where one dies for 3 days and then comes back again. In the talk about the secret gospel of Mark, talks about that the end of the whole story of the end of Gethsemane, we read it in Mark, that when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper, when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, one of the other people found at that point is this young man who just had a loincloth on him, and he goes running off and isn't captured. And in the secret book of Mark, it says that this young man was actually Mark, and what was happening was part of an initiation ceremony, that there was again this sort of preparation, and that Mark was being prepared as part of, and had maybe even, if we bring in the Acts of John, he may even have been the initiation candidate during John. And this all gets kind of disruptive in the Gethsemane. So it's kind of an interesting idea that there may have been a series of different sort of initiations that were done that were about the death and the resurrection around this time. So it's something to think about, something to look into. And when I first heard about that, I thought, oh, this is pretty wild. But then I looked in the book of Mark in my regular Bible, and there is a small couple little verses there that talk about this. And of course, Mark appears quite early on in the Acts of the Apostles. So while he's not part of the original 12, he's clearly in this sort of group of the early disciples. As Drusiana and Androcles is also shows up later in the Acts of John. So it's kind of a bit of an overview. Of course, the whole idea of death and rebirth and the resurrection, it's something like, like Steve was talking about earlier, when we look at any sort of shamanic or any sort of initiation process, every initiation is a bit of a death and rebirth. And of course, there's big glamorous ones like we hear about in the Masonic systems, but every initiation is a bit like, oh, there we go. Every initiation involves a death rebirth. And even if we think about systems like, graduation ceremonies or other sort of life packages, it is a bit of dying to your old self and coming anew. So it's kind of a bit of a humor thing I wanted to kind of end this with, and also open this up for discussion. I thought there's some films we can think of too around this time. One of the more interesting ones, which some of the Gnostic idea in it, of course, is the last temptation of Christ, which addresses the question of, if Christ was God, why did he allow himself to be crucified? And couldn't he have avoided being crucified if he wanted to? It's an old one, it's good. Jesus Christ Superstar is interesting because it's again, 1973, but it has an interesting take on Judas. And actually, the take on Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar is really similar to the Gospel of Judas. In the Gospel of Judas, there's long-running discussions with Jesus from Judas about whether or not he's going to go through with this all. In fact, Judas at some point say, I'm going to blow up all your plans and not going through and betray you. And Jesus like, no, you're going to do what you have to do. And in the Gospel of Judas, he's told, you're going to do this because you're actually stronger than any of my other disciples to carry out this. Yeah. But it's interesting that the same words almost come up per se in Jesus Christ Superstar, where there's these discussions between Judas and Jesus of whether or not he's going to go through and do the betrayal. And there's some fun scenes in here with Herod and that as well. So, have you guys seen this? I know you're all a bit younger than me, so.
I've seen the musical. I don't think I've seen the film of the musical, but I've seen the musical live. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun. And if you want some newer ones that are very non-traditional, shorter but completely irreverent, this is a Brazilian film. They're currently out there on Netflix, if you have Netflix. And the first one was The Last Hangover, which is a rather irreverent take on the Last Supper, but kind of fun. And then The First Temptation of Christ is one where before Jesus begins his ministry. So it's just kind of some fun stuff if you feel too heavy and bogged down with things. So that's pretty much what I have here. Does anyone have any discussions, questions? I think I have the schedule. I didn't put the schedule in here.
I think one dilemma, I don't know if other people feel it as well, Pam, is that excuse me, as someone who defined myself as a Christian in my past, but I don't think of myself specifically in those terms now, it's kind of it can feel a little bit jarring, kind of being so in contact with this story again. I just noticed that for myself. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I know this story, but I'm trying to reapproach it with new eyes, and I kind of find that both kind of inspiring, difficult, challenging. There's loads of stuff going on for me by revisiting this, but trying to do it with new eyes.
Yeah, I think there's I can kind of see that. I know I was out of it for, there was a period of my life where I wasn't really involved with Christianity in any way. And then I guess I came back to things. So while I'd been, I'd kind of gone through this realm of, after I got on my Buddhist period, going into a paganism for about 10 years. And during that time, my husband at that point was studying Gnosticism. So I got a little bit involved with Gnosticism from the side, but not in any sort of real serious way. And then I kind of came back into Gnosticism after a kind of what would you call, a very traumatic, chaotic time in my life. And actually they had me running, not only coming back to Gnosticism, but I actually went to worship in a regular Lutheran church for a while too, simply because I needed that sort of support. Yeah, I could see how the story itself is rather, I want to say it's rather gruesome, but it brings up a lot of questions, and I think it needs to be approached as kind of I find it best to approach it as mythology. I keep thinking about it, reading a lot. Of course, there's so much stuff about the Vikings these days. And I'd been reading that they were having trouble the big trouble with selling Christianity to the Vikings was that they had trouble getting over this idea of how do you have a God that, allows himself to be killed? How can you kill a God? How can mortals kill a God? And then how can you have a God? What's the deal with having a God who allows himself to be killed? And what is his sacrifice? And from what I've read, it took some of the Christian missionaries time to learn a little bit about the Norse mythology. Then once they found out about Odin having hung himself on a tree for wisdom, then they were able to kind of apply that back to this idea of Christ. And they would introduce the myths like, okay, Christ is a bit like Odin. Christ is essentially, as Odin sacrificed his eye and hung on the tree for wisdom, this is a similar idea of what Christ did. And Christ did it for all of us. Jesus did this for all of us. And that's when you see some of the carvings, the early carvings of the Vikings, of the Christian carvings of Christian Vikings, you'll notice it almost looks like the resurrected Christ. They're not crucifix, there's not the thorns, there's not the wounds in the hand. It's very much this sort of Christ on the tree, and you can see how, it's almost an Odin-like depiction. And that was, I think, a question I always had growing up. I had this whole thing of like, well, if Jesus was God, then Jesus knew what was going to happen, and he knows he's going to rise again in 3 days. So like, what the hell? It's like a little bit of a, let's just go and take a little bit of a journey here through something unpleasant, but all going to be good in the end. So who cares?
Sorry, Pamela.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's kind of what I've been thinking about this week as well, sort of coming up to this this kind of Easter period, really. Just taking that kind of inspiration of just thinking, well, whatever happens, here on earth, it is a transitory period, and so it is. Yeah, I've kind of taken a bit of comfort from that really last couple of weeks, and it's especially sort of it's kind of timed it quite well, I guess, because I've got that this sort of this period of sort of contemplation and celebration, and kind of using that example of especially sort of yesterday on Palm Sunday, just that idea of kind of going in, Jesus going in, and and he knew what was going to happen and knew what was going to happen afterwards, and he could do that because he didn't have any fear of what was to come, I guess. So it's been quite a useful kind of example, really, last week or so.
Yeah, and the Bailey people, the Alice people, in the writings of Alice Bailey, she talks about that one of the changes that's supposed to happen somewhere before 2030 or 2050 is that science will discover the existence of a soul. But what people think that they meant by that really was that there will be this adoption of this idea of reincarnation, that the soul is eternal, so that we're all just incarnating at different times. And that part of the outcome of that will be that, as you just said, that our existence here is rather transitory. We're spiritual beings having this sort of earthly existence, put into these sorts of body with all of our limitations or gifts that we might have, and we've chosen this particular experience with the sort of baggage or benefits we've had because of our social economic structure or the times or the pressures on us, having limited maybe what we can experience. But that's the drama we're playing out now. That we are more than this current incarnation, and that after this incarnation we still go on, but we take up a different role the next time, and the role changes, and gender changes and culture change, and it's all about having, giving the experience for the soul and the gradual sort of evolution and learning on the soul level. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my current belief, I think, on it, is and I think it's best to approach, we've got so many mythologies in that within, at our disposal within Gnosticism. And, certainly some groups like the Sethians never believed in this. I think it's hard to say what the early Christian view of this was, because there is also the idea that around some of the groups was that Jesus, of course, couldn't have died on the cross, that he went on and lived. And maybe he's just, he's just escaped Palestine and continued on in another place. Kind of starts falling along the ideas of, of Mary Magdalene, having a child with Jesus and going on. And in a lot of the myths where that happened, it was in the French myths, it was Mary Magdalene and Martha, and sometimes even Lazarus. So it's these same groups of people who were there in the book of John, going forward and starting a new life in Spain. Life in France, that would have been.
Yeah, that's a crazy rabbit hole to go down. It's a lot of
Hello, Pam?
Yeah.
Hold on a minute. People keep Skyping me. I tell them I got meetings. Hold on.
All right.
You guys talk among yourself. Let me, how many I got to mute here?
Pam, I'm about to head off anyway, so
Let's see. my Zoom's not coming up here. Hold on.
Oh, no, not to worry, Pam. Listen, I've lost the tile from the roof.
Hold on a minute, Robert. I gotta call you back. I'm on a call.
All right.
Sorry about that, guys.
It's all right. Pam, I'm heading out anyway, so I'll see you. I'll see you Friday or Thursday evening. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about this.
It's all right. Don't worry.
Yeah, no worries. I've got to look
Yeah,
after Alice
okay.
now. So
See you Thursday evening, Pam, at 7.
Okay, yeah, and email
Thanks,
me
Pam.
anything and let me know if anybody wants to be the candidate part.
I'll be the candidate.
You'll be
if
the
you
candidate? Okay, great, Dinah. Good.
Excellent. See you later.
Okay,
like.
Thanks,
we'll see
Pamela.
everybody on Thursday then.
yeah, thanks for
Thank
yesterday
you.
as well.
Okay, thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.